Folks, over the last little while, the NFL has been in the news because of this the lockout. Now it looks like it's going to be over, but the NFL is going to be on the front burner in the courts because of the class action suit. There is some allegations that the NFL knew and has known since the 1920s about how serious concussions can be and the health implications they might have for star players and players in general. Joining us right now to talk about this and this lawsuit is Irvin Muchnick, who is an expert reporter on this kind of thing, and his book, Chris and Nancy, The True Story of the Benoit Murder, Suicide, and Pro Wrestling's Cocktail of Death, joins us right now. Irv, thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks for having me. I think at least on my side of the border, while everybody is obsessed with when they can break out the beer and guacamole and chips and have their tailgate parties, this concussion story is something that's going to last far beyond the lockout in the 2011 season. It's a huge public health issue.
It is. I mean, and obviously we love NFL football up in Canada. We have the CFL, where there's a couple of players who've been very vocal about it, but it goes into our first love, which is hockey, and we've seen a lot of enforcers who have had issues with concussions as well. So this is, while it might be predominantly an NFL story down in the United States, it covers a whole bunch of different sports.
Yes, for sure. But the $9 billion a year NFL is at the white-hot center of this story because it is positioned much like the tobacco industry was in previous generations, of having tremendous knowledge of the huge health risks that participants are taking from this activity. And now we're at a point where we have to be answering two questions. One, who should be playing tackle football at the amateur level? And two, who is going to pay the tab for the costs to society and the public of diminished academic achievement, reduced workforce productivity, and increased violent criminal behavior as a result of things that really were not nearly as well known as they should have been until very recently.
So you're saying that this lawsuit might go much deeper in that. How will it affect, colleges? Will they be on the hook for a player that they gave a scholarship to who might not have made the NFL but did have concussion problems while playing in, whether it's any number of different NCAA levels, that they might go on to have a history of crime, and what kind of attachment concussions might have to that?
Well, there's no end to the implications of this subject. As for the lawsuit itself, I know very little about it except that it's been reported on TMZ, and it was filed in Los Angeles by a group of former NFL players. So I don't know how well constructed the lawsuit is. What we do know is this. In 1928, the term dementia pugilistica was coined by researchers to describe what we call punch-drunk syndrome in boxers, and it took an additional, 70 years for that to be isolated in football players by a renegade African forensic pathologist working in Pittsburgh by the name of Dr. Bennett Omalu, who for his trouble was ostracized from the NFL Old Boys network of team physicians and researchers who have been cooking the books for the NFL since at least the mid-'90s.
Do you believe, as alleged in this lawsuit, and again, we're quoting TMZ here, but they, as silly as that might sound, they turn out to be right more often than not. But in the lawsuit, they claim that the NFL, when they commissioned a study in 1994, and it was entitled NFL Committee on Mild Traumatic Brain Injury, and published a report also in 2004, concluding that there was no evidence of worsening injury or chronic cumulative effects. Do you believe that report, those two reports, were cooked, or do you believe, I mean, let's face it, even in the last 2 years, we know much more about how the brain works and how severe the implications can be. And there's a lot that we don't know, and that's why, thankfully, we've got a lot of these players donating their brain to science. Do you believe they were willfully misdirecting people, or do you believe that they were ignorant to the facts?
Well, what we do know is this. The Mild Traumatic Brain Injury Committee was formed by the NFL in the mid-'90s because there was increased evidence of these players are bigger and stronger and steroid bulk, and whatever we knew about head injuries before that, it was multiplying and rapidly as star players had to retire and so forth. They formed this committee. In 2002, Dr. Amalu did the first of the autopsies on a cluster of Pittsburgh Steelers players who died suddenly and strangely. And the Steelers team neurosurgeon, Dr. Joseph Maroon, who is also, by the way, the medical director for World Wrestling Entertainment. What does that tell you about his bona fides? Yeah. Dr. Maroon lied and said that Terry Long, the Pittsburgh Steelers player who committed suicide by drinking antifreeze, had never had a concussion. And there was documentation in Dr. Maroon's own reports to the contrary. So that's one piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is simply that the NFL controlled a series of articles published in the prestigious journal Neurosurgery, and it was edited by an NFL consultant, and these articles downplayed and poo-pooed the mounting evidence and research on chronic traumatic encephalopathy, as far as how much is willfulness, how much is the denial that we all carry as human beings. I mean, the courts would sort these things out, assuming that the Los Angeles lawsuit the pleadings have been professionally and well done, and I don't know that either. I do know that the issue is a real one, and it's a time bomb for the $9 billion a year NFL, which is operated much like the tobacco industry on the issue of brain trauma.
And it's a rethink about, I mean, up here in Canada, because of body checking and concussions, there is no hitting in the house leagues, the minor leagues, if you will, where young kids are playing, and they don't want hitting until you are, into your teens. And I don't know how you can have football without tackling, just as some people might make the same argument about hockey. Irvin Muchnick, who is an author and an expert reporter and writer on concussions in sport, and it really is reaching a bit of a crossroads here. So just before the break, Irv, we kind of put it in a position where if the NFL and if football and if sports are facing this kind of real reality where they have to tell their players right up front, listen, we know this. We only know one way to play the game, and it's going to mean that some of you are going to be seriously hurt, so you have to sign off on all of this. Is that something that's doable?
Well, you framed it very well, Jim, because whether you're amateurs or professionals is the key threshold here. But let me just say this, that I don't think that for the general public, the issue is so much about the risks that multi-million-dollar professionals choose to take to enrich themselves and get glory in mass entertainment. But when you're talking about the NFL, you're talking about a huge marketing colossus that reaches down to all levels of American society, to colleges, to high schools, to peewee leagues. And there's no such thing as informed consent for a 10-year-old kid who's taking repeated concussive blows and subconcussive blows, and he and his parents do not have full knowledge of what that can mean for the trajectory of their future health. So we've got to separate those things out. We have the lawsuit by a group of retired disabled players in the NFL over increasing pension and disability benefits, and that's one thing. We have this new lawsuit reported by TMZ alleging a cover-up on the concussion issue in particular by pro football players. And then we have to go on to talk as a society, and our elected leaders have to join this conversation about, what is the activity of football and who can play it and when can they play it. We don't let kids smoke cigarettes, and we need to be seriously considering whether kids under the age of X, and I don't know what X is, should be playing tackle football.
And so you get into a situation where some leagues up in Canada where there's no contact and no checking, you say you can't do it until you're a teenager. Some people say that's not hockey. Others would say if it's flag football, that's not real football, and you don't get to that you have to teach them young, because unless you learn how to tackle properly, that's what's going to lead to some of these problems.
Well, without question, we've got an entirely new paradigm for the way sports are played, and it's going to require a big rewiring and rethinking by all of us. And whether we want to face that or not is an open question. Now, we like our junk entertainment, and we like our violence, and but we can't bury our heads in the sand about the research on traumatic brain injury.
It's shameful how the NFL has treated some of their past players, some of them heroes in the game, in terms of medical expenses and all that kind of stuff, considering the profit margins that are made in the game. I hope the new collective bargaining, I'm not sure if it's even on the table, but hopefully it's something that will be addressed. But do you honestly believe that this lawsuit has a leg to stand on, in that proving that the NFL knew that things were worse and they didn't tell the players? It's hard for me to believe, only because, as we said earlier, that these players are continuing to donate their brains to science, because, what we learned 5 years ago and in 5 years, we know way more about brain injury than we did 5 years ago.
Well, Jim, I don't know that this lawsuit is going to be the key to the kingdom. What I do know is that if we're not going to have the conversation about this in other forums, it is inevitable that lawsuits by individuals and by classes are going to drive this story into the future as the lockout is settled, and as the NFL sets up a nearly, I understand it, a $1 billion legacy fund to increase the benefits to ex-players, which I think was what the Carl Eller Group's lawsuit was mostly about.
Yep.
As all of these things move forward, it is inevitable that we're going to be learning more and more, and that people are going to be filing lawsuits, as they did in tobacco cases, and the story is going to be further laid bare. Now, what the conclusion of that is, I don't know, but I'm a reporter, and I'm going to help lay bare those facts.
Do you think there's any appetite for, getting the sport, I'm going to say, whether it would be wimpy or not, but to such an extent where we were so afraid to hit somebody that, certainly I think this is going to have to be something that the NFL is going to have to say, this is the cost of us doing business, that we're going to have to sacrifice some of these lives if we're going to have an entertaining product, because to, dilute it to the point where it's going to be, a hug fest or flag football, nobody wants to watch that.
Yeah, it's a tough call at the pragmatic level. I don't dispute that, and I don't think that it's easy to redesign rules. Now, football has been through something like this previously. President Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century, after a rash of deaths, is given credit for spurring reforms of the way the game was played and improvements in equipment and so forth. And part of that is part of the answer. But football has come a long way from the sort of Ivy League system that they had in the early 20th century, where it was a mostly amateur sport, where men participated in it to buff up their resumes for jobs on Wall Street and in business, to this huge $9 billion global marketing juggernaut. And I think it's a lot harder to get your arms around it now than it was in the era of Teddy Roosevelt.
The technology is so amazing these days. It's hard to believe. And is it Riddell or Rydell, the helmet maker? They're involved in this lawsuit as well. It's hard to believe that, and I know that nobody would keep something off of the market, but it's hard to believe that we can't get a better helmet that would be able to make things a little safer.
Well, I have a unique perspective on this helmet question because I think that, and I don't question that Riddell or any other helmet manufacturer is doing what they can to make a buck. But if they could put out the perfect concussion-proof helmet, they would do so because they'd make a lot of money. I think that to some extent, the helmet manufacturers are a distraction from this whole issue. And I've criticized the New York Times, which has led the mainstream media coverage of the sports concussion issue, because they're so focused on investigations of Riddell by two federal agencies and by Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico. And I don't think it's concussions. I don't think it's helmets. Helmets, if anything, as they're improved, are going to increase the ability of these large, fast athletes to inflict damage on each other, much in the way that boxing gloves, in moving from the bare knuckles day of boxing, make head injuries worse in boxing.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Helmets protect the weapon; they don't protect the head.
It's an interesting analogy because same argument is made up here in Canada, where you put on a helmet and the respect that you have for the other player goes down a little bit, because if you see somebody with their head exposed, you might be less likely to hit them as if you think that they're protected and invincible. It's
right. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we don't need to be investigating helmet manufacturers, but I don't think they should be scapegoated.
Yep.
The people in charge here are Commissioner Roger Goodell and the National Football League. They're sitting atop a ton of money, and they're not taking much responsibility for the public health fallout of their marketing.
Well,
efforts.
It's an interesting story, and I'm sure we haven't heard the end of it. Irv, thank you very much for your time. I hope you can join us again in the future.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Irvin Muchnick is an expert when it comes to concussions. His book is Chris and Nancy, the true story of the Benoit murder-suicide and pro wrestling's cocktail of death, but also a lot of work into the brain injuries in the NFL.